Echo froze before Calder heard the sound. 1 second, the dog was padding beside him through the mist. The next, he was stone-still hackles, lifting nose, cutting the air like a blade. The mountain rain had finally broken after 3 days of pounding, but runoff still roared in the ravine below, swollen and angry. Calder checked the sky. Another band of storm was sliding in before nightfall. If they didn't shore the slope, the hillside behind the cabin could give way. "Easy, boy," he murmured. "We're out of time." Echo didn't move. He stared at a patch of ground that was slowly sinking. And then the earth caved in. Echo lunged forward first, skidding to the collapsing edge before Calder could grab his collar. Echo back, Calder barked boots, sliding in the mud as he hauled the dog away from the rim. The soil kept spilling a wet hiss as the ground sloughed into a widening hollow. The storm had carved out more than runoff. It had opened a wound in the mountain itself, fresh, raw, unnatural. Calder crouched, breathing hard. The air smelled of broken roots and cold minerals, but beneath it, something metallic. Echo caught it too. He whined sharply, pawing at the rim with frantic precision rather than panic. "Not an animal," Calder muttered. Echo stiffened again, nose locked on a jutting seam of rusted steel now visible between torn layers of earth. A shape, a panel, a door. Calder's pulse kicked. He hadn't built anything here. No one had not in decades. Another rumble of distant thunder rolled down the ridge. The next storm band was minutes away. Light was fading. The slope was unstable. And Echo, usually calm as stone, was trembling with urgency. Whatever lay beneath that metal wasn't just old. It was waiting. Calder eased back as the slope creaked under its own weight, a low, unsettled groan in the earth. Echo stayed glued to his side, now chest-heaving eyes locked on that rusted seam as if it were alive. The dog wasn't prone to theatrics. 6 years together had taught Calder the difference between curiosity and warning. This was warning. Pure, sharpened instinct. "Come on," Calder murmured. "We need daylight for whatever that thunder muttered again, a slow growl across the eastern ridge." Echo stayed rigid for one last second before finally backing away. Only when they were halfway up the path did Calder realize he kept glancing over his shoulder, checking that the earth hadn't swallowed anything else. The trail to the cabin was slick with rain, the clay-rich soil smearing beneath his boots. The Appalachian foothills were beautiful in the autumn maple canopies, dripping gold, a thin veil of fog threading between the dark pines, but storms like this stripped the mountains back to their bones. Water carved away topsoil, trees uprooted without warning. Small landslides were common in the northern stretch of the valley. That was new. The cabin came into view at the crest-weathered cedar siding tin roof, patched in 2 places, chimney leaning a little too much for comfort. Calder had known from the start that the place required more work than he had hours, but the isolation had called to him louder than practicality. A place where no one knew his name. A place where the world didn't scream. Echo trotted ahead, shook rain from his coat, and stopped at the porch steps, watching Calder with expectant eyes. "I know," Calder said. "We'll go back. We're just not doing it blind." He pulled open the shed door and grabbed the lantern, first battery-powered, reliable, bright enough to fight back dusk. Tools hung neatly on the walls, arranged with almost military rigidity. Calder hadn't planned it that way. His hands had simply moved as they'd been trained. A hammer where a hammer belongs. A length of paracord coiled with surgeon. Like precision. Order made the world predictable. Predictable meant safe. Echo brushed his head against Calder's knee. "Not now," Calder murmured, though he let his hand drop to the dog's neck. Echo leaned into the touch with a soft exhale. The storm 2 nights ago had rattled Calder worse than he cared to admit. It wasn't the thunder. It was the sudden, violent silence afterward. The kind of silence that left memory space to breathe. He hadn't slept much since. Echo had sensed it hovering close, resting his weight against Calder whenever the flashbacks threatened to pull him under. 6 years old, rescued from a shelter with a history no one could fully explain. Echo was gentle by default, but hyper, attuned to emotional fracture. Calder had seen him calm, skittish children navigate chaotic parking lots, and once alert an elderly hiker to a drop in blood sugar. He wasn't trained for any of it, he simply knew. And now something in that sinking patch of earth had rattled him deeply. Calder grabbed a waterproof jacket from the peg. "Last look before dark," he said. Echo was through the doorway first. The slope was an open wound now, wider, deeper, the edges still dripping with runoff. Mist crept along the ground as evening folded in. Calder lit the lantern, the beam slicing through the gloom. The metal seam was clearer now, a square outline roughly 3 feet on each side, edges rough with rust and soil. A latch or hinge might have once been visible before decades buried it alive. Echo paced in a tight circle nose, working the air as if scent alone could tell him the truth. Calder crouched again, lantern angled low. "Anybody put you there," he murmured, as though the mountain might answer. Old-timers in the hollow had always said these ridges kept their secrets. Bootlegger tunnels, abandoned mines, forgotten storage pits from the days when families hid valuables during the worst winters. But Calder hadn't seen any signs of alteration in months living here, not a seam in the bedrock, not a suspicious depression. And this wasn't natural. Rain spattered harder. The wind funneled through the hollows in a long, breathy moan. "Tomorrow," Calder said, finally. "We dig tomorrow." Echo's ears twitched in protest. "I know," Calder said, "but the slope's not stable, and I'm not losing you to a mudslide." The dog reluctantly stepped back. Inside, the cabin dusk pressed against the windows. Calder started a small fire in the wood stove dry hickory he'd split in the last warm spell. The sweet, smoky scent steadied him. Echo took his spot near the hearthhead, resting on his paws, but his eyes didn't drift toward sleep. He watched Calder with the steady focus of someone refusing to stand down. Calder hung the jacket, poured water into a dented kettle, and set it on the stove's iron plate. His hands still trembled faintly. He didn't like that. Trembling meant loss of control. Loss of control meant danger. "You're thinking too loud," he said to Echo. The dog lifted his head tail, giving one soft thump. Calder sat on the floor beside him. Ever since he'd arrived in the Highlands 5 months ago, nights had followed the same rhythm chores, simple meals, quiet. He'd chosen this ridge specifically for its solitude. The closest neighbor lived nearly 2 miles down a dirt road that washed out every spring. The postmaster joked that Calder lived in the land of the missing signals, and he wasn't wrong. Cell reception flickered between one bar and none. Calder didn't mind. The fewer voices, the better. But tonight, the quiet felt heavier, pressurized, like the stillness before something shifted. He let his hand rest on Echo's ribcage, feeling the slow, steady breathing. "You caught it first," he whispered. "Whatever it is." Echo nudged him back gently, as if to say that the mystery wasn't the danger, ignoring it was. By morning, the rain had thinned to a cold drizzle. Low cloud clung to the ridge in pale shreds. Calder drank his coffee black, as always sitting at the small pine table, while Echo paced restlessly from window to door and back again. "All right," Calder said. "Let's see what we're dealing with." He packed with soldier's efficiency gloves, crowbar folding, shovel rope, tarp, a thermos of hot water, and 2 protein bars he knew Echo would steal half of if given the chance. He almost grabbed his sidearm out of habit, then left it in the lockbox. This wasn't a battlefield. It was dirt and rust and time. At least that's what he told himself. Echo bounded ahead on the path, stopping every few yards to glance back and confirm Calder was following. The dog's gait was light, but his ears were wired forward alert. The pit had grown overnight. Rain had eroded one side into a sharper drop. Calder circled wide, checking for undercut sections. The metal door sat exposed, now by nearly a foot, its surface mottled with rust blooms and flaking paint. He brushed away debris carefully, hands steadying around the edges. Someone had built this with intention. Someone who believed it needed hiding. Private root cellar Calder guessed aloud. Echo whined the same sound he made when Calder guessed wrong during training games. "Okay," Calder said, "not a cellar." He scraped more mud away. A circular handle emerged at the center, heavy industrial, like the wheel of an old pressure hatch. Calder stared. "Who in the holler builds a sealed metal chamber?" he muttered. Echo angled his nose directly at the handle and growled, low wary, reverberating. Calder felt the hair rise on his arms. The Appalachians weren't strangers to buried things. Calder had met locals who spoke of entire shacks swallowed by landslides of coal shafts, collapsing and opening caverns nobody knew existed. But this was deliberate architecture, not collapse, construction. He set to work digging the frame free. The metal resisted at first, fused to soil after decades underground. Echo stayed close, pacing perimeter watch like it was second nature. Every few minutes, Echo paused, sniffed the air sharply, then circled again, not scared, alert, purposeful. Calder's shovel scraped something solid beneath the edge. He switched to the crowbar, wedging the tip between the metal and earth. The hatch groaned. A shiver crawled up his spine. He didn't believe in omens, but Echo did. The dog suddenly pressed close behind him, body stiff. "What is it?" Calder whispered. Echo stared into the forest ears, straight tail locked. The kind of posture he used when hearing something from an impossible distance. Calder followed his gaze. Nothing moved between the pines, nothing visible. But Echo didn't back down. "Okay," Calder said quietly. "We're not alone out here, are we?" Wind slipped through the leaves like a whispered answer. The day wore on. Calder returned to the cabin twice for supplies. Echo refused to leave the pit's edge. By late afternoon, they'd freed enough of the metal plate to expose its full outline, 3 feet by 3. Reinforced edges. The wheel handle was stiff, but not fused. Someone had engineered it to survive time. Calder rested on his heels, sweat cooling on his back despite the chill. Echo nosed the metal again and gave a frustrated huff. "You want it open," Calder said. Echo pressed his paw against the steel, lightly, insistently. "You're sure?" A soft bark, one sharp beat of certainty. Then Calder set both hands on the wheel. The metal vibrated beneath his palms, cold, stubborn, but not dead. "On 3, he murmured. Thunder rolled in the far mountains. 1. Echo crouched, muscles taut. 2. Calder braced his boots in the damp soil. He took a long breath. 3. Calder turned the wheel. It screamed, metal shrieking against years of corrosion. Echo barked once warning or encouragement, Calder couldn't tell. The wheel gave an inch, then another. Then, a final groan echoed through the pit as the locking mechanism broke loose. Cold air surged from below, carrying the smell of stone, dust, and something older than the cabin. Not rot, not mold. Something preserved. Echo stepped back, ears flattened. Calder held the lantern over the crack that had opened along the hinge. A breath from the mountain exhaled upward like something waking from long sleep. Calder swallowed hard. Echo, this wasn't meant to be found. But the dog nudged his knee steady and insistent. Calder lifted the hatch, and the dark opened its eye. Cold air spilled from the opening like breath from a stone throat. Calder angled the lantern over the rim, expecting maybe dirt, maybe a collapsing shaft. Instead, the light disappeared down a narrow, concrete stairwell, clean lines, straight angles, no signs of natural formation, man-made, purpose-built, and deeply buried. Echo lowered his head, sniffing hard at the darkness. His ears twitched, then flattened slightly. Not fear, caution. "I know," Calder whispered. "Feels wrong." He ran his fingers along the hatch frame. Smooth welds, no seams beyond what he'd cleared. Whoever built this hadn't intended it to be found by any casual wanderer or by anyone at all. This wasn't a cellar dug by a farmer. It was a sealed entry, and it was waiting. Calder swung the lantern lower. The concrete steps vanished into shadow after 10 feet. The air rising up held no stench, no decay, no mold. Instead, it smelled like old paper dust, and something metallic, like old tools left untouched for decades. Echo nudged his elbow. "You want to go first?" Calder asked, attempting a grim smile. Echo stared down the opening tail, stiff, then flicked his gaze back to Calder and let out a soft, urgent woof. "You're kidding," Echo woofed again. "You think I'm letting you lead into a sealed bunker from who knows when, the dog Saturday, a single decisive movement." Then he looked down again. Calder exhaled through his nose. Echo had saved his skin more times than he cared to count, sometimes from intruders, sometimes from memories that didn't let go without a fight. If Echo said something was down there, it was down there. But if Echo wasn't volunteering to enter, that meant the risk wasn't just structural. "All right," Calder murmured. "I'll check the first few steps." He set the lantern on its lowest setting to minimize glare. He tied a length of rope around the hatch frame and looped the end around his waist. Habit. Always leave a lifeline. Always plan for the unseen. The first step groaned under his weight but held. Concrete, thicker than necessary, maybe reinforced. Echo paced at the rim nails, tapping anxiously. "I'm right here," Calder said. The second step. The third. The light pushed deeper, revealing a tight corridor walls, poured smooth ceiling, low but even. Just wide enough for 2 people side by side. No markings, no cobwebs, no wildlife. This place had been sealed so thoroughly that time had barely touched it. At the base of the stairs lay a narrow landing, and a single metal door, heavy gauge, hinged like a vault. And it was cracked open. Calder's pulse thudded in his ears. No wind stirred. No footprints disturbed the thin dust on the floor. The lantern beam trembled slightly as he knelt. Someone had opened the door before it was buried. Recently, no. Impossible. The layer of soil above had to be decades deep. The hatch wheel had been immovable until he forced it. So why was the inner door ajar? Echo whined behind him. Calder looked up the stairs. "Not yet," he whispered. "Stay there." He pushed the door slowly. Rusted hinges groaned, but not from disuse, from misalignment, as though the frame had shifted long ago. Inside was a small chamber, 15 feet by 10 concrete walls bare except for shelves lining one side. A narrow desk sat in the corner. Dust layered everything like snow, yet the room carried no smell of mold, no sign of collapse. It was preserved, intentional. Calder stepped inside, lantern held high. On the shelves lay small crates unlabeled, sealed with melted wax. On the desk sat a battered metal box, no larger than a shoebox. Beside it, a stack of old paper bound with twine. And beneath that, a lone photograph in a cracked frame. Calder stopped breathing for a beat. He set the lantern down gently and picked up the frame. The picture inside was faded, curled along the edges. 3 men standing shoulder to shoulder in front of a younger version of Calder's cabin, fresh paint, new roof pride in their faces. Calder recognized only one, the man on the right, tall, broad-shouldered, smiling widely, his grandfather. A cold ache entered Calder's chest. He whispered, "What were you doing up here?" Gramps' echo barked once from the hatch above, sharp, urgent. It echoed down the concrete walls, unnaturally loud. Calder turned. Echo wasn't barking at him. He was barking at the forest behind the pit. Calder's skin tightened. "We're done down here." He grabbed the metal box and the stack of papers, tucking them under his arm, then hurried back up the stairs. Echo stood rigid, staring into the tree line. Calder followed his gaze. Movement. Small. Faint. Maybe a deer shifting in the underbrush. Maybe no. The timing was wrong. Too aligned with Echo's alarm. "There's no reason for anyone to be up here," Calder whispered. "Not today." The forest offered no answer. Calder closed the hatch as quietly as possible, covering it fast with the tarp he'd brought. Echo circled twice, sticking close enough, their shoulders brushed. "All right," Calder said, voice tense. "Inside. Let's go." They moved briskly up the path. Once the cabin came into view, Echo finally relaxed slightly, but he kept glancing back. Calder felt it too, the prickle along the spine that said they hadn't been alone. Inside the cabin, Calder placed the metal box on the kitchen table. Echo lay down nearby, but he didn't settle. His eyes stayed fixed on the door. "Whatever's in here better be worth that scare," Calder muttered. He undid the clasps. Inside lay a rolled blueprint, edges brittle, a set of keys, a battered journal wrapped in cloth, a small brass plaque engraved with 3 initials, HRR. Calder frowned. His grandfather's initials were different. So whose box was this? He reached for the journal. Echo's tail brushed the floor anxiously. "Yeah," Calder murmured. "I feel it too." The first pages were mundane weather notes, expenses, supply lists. But 5 entries in the handwriting changed sharper, more cramped. The tone shifted. Words like pressure, secrecy, construction, and agreements appeared. And one line underlined twice, "We bury the truth on this ridge, and time will swallow it with us." Calder felt the cabin tilt slightly, not physically, but in a way that meant understanding was inching toward him, unwelcome and unstoppable. "Who were you hiding from?" Calder whispered. Echo lifted his head ears, pivoting. Calder froze. The sound came again, a soft crunch outside. Gravel under weight. Then another. Someone was walking toward his porch. Calder closed the journal, silently pushed the box under the table, and rose to his feet. "Echo," he whispered. The dog stood instantly, posture rigid, eyes locked on the door. A firm knock sounded 3 slow beats. Echo's growl hummed through the floorboards. Calder steadied his breath. The storm had unearthed something old, but the person at his door was very much alive, and they knew exactly when to arrive. Calder stepped toward the entrance, Echo glued to his thigh, growl thrumming steadily. The knock didn't repeat. Whoever stood outside wasn't impatient. They were waiting not for courtesy, but for acknowledgement. Calder shifted his stance to the side of the doorframe, keeping out of direct line with any sightline. Old habits. Ones he didn't unlearn, even though he'd tried. Echo mirrored him perfectly, a silent shadow. "State your business," Calder said. His voice came out calm. Too calm. The kind of calm that came when adrenaline rose but found discipline instead of panic. A man answered. "It's Dr. Mara Leland. I believe I sent you a letter last month. I was hoping to speak." A woman's voice, steady, confident, not local, and not timid. She sounded like someone used to pushing through closed doors. Echo's growl softened to a warning rumble, more caution than threat. Calder's pulse shifted. Mara Leland. He did remember the name. A researcher who'd written asking permission to look at historical boundary plats from his ridge. He'd thrown the letter out. People researching old land deeds never meant anything good. Calder cracked the door 2 inches. Not enough for her to see inside. Enough for him to see her. She stood on the porch in a rain-slick coat, dark green hood down despite the drizzle. Her hair was tied back neatly. Her boots were mud, splashed but new. She held a waterproof satchel tight against her side. Her eyes weren't prying, they were measuring. "Mr. Rourke," she asked. "Depends. I'm sorry to show up unannounced. But your ridge this land holds records my team hasn't been able to access anywhere else. I hoped you might reconsider. You came up here alone." His tone was sharper than intended. A flicker crossed her face, something like a mixture of resolve and embarrassment. "I did. I wasn't followed." Calder didn't ask how she could be certain. One glance at Echo told him the dog would have known. Echo hadn't signaled threat, only unease. A stranger, but not danger. Yet, Calder opened the door just wide enough for Echo to step forward and sniff the air. Echo's posture remained guarded, but he didn't bare teeth. Mara's shoulders relaxed only slightly. "May I come in?" No, Calder said. "But you can talk." For a heartbeat, she looked offended, then caught herself and nodded. "All right." She reached into her satchel. Echo tensed, but she moved slowly, carefully. She produced a folder thick with photocopied maps and yellowed forms. "Your property line wasn't always this boundary," she said. "This ridge used to be part of a larger tract. 3 families owned it jointly back in the 1932. Then 2 withdrew, 1 expanded. The records get messy around 1957. I came because something in those old transfer notes doesn't add up." Calder's jaw tightened. 57, around the time the hatch must have been sealed. "You're saying there's a mistake in the deeds." "I'm saying there might have been a deliberate alteration." She held his eyes. "Something was carved out, hidden. And whatever it was, it sits on your land now." Calder kept his breath even. "You didn't drive up here for a clerical error." "No," she admitted softly. "I didn't." A bead of rain ticked against the tin roof. Mara shifted, lowering her voice. I think something was buried on this ridge. Something important. I've been tracing 3 names through old ledgers, Harlan Keene, Brant Leland, and Rowan Rourke." She searched his face. "Any relation?" Echo's ears snapped forward. Calder felt the question like a stone dropped into old water. "Rowan Rourke. His grandfather." Calder didn't answer. He didn't have to. His silence was enough. Mara continued. "Your grandfather's name vanished from most records around 1959. So did Keene's and Leland's. But the land transfers between them didn't vanish. Someone sealed them away." The burn in Calder's throat spread downward. "Rowan, what were you mixed up in?" Echo nudged his thigh, grounding him. Calder said quietly, "What exactly are you looking for?" "Truth," she answered. "And maybe what was stolen?" From who? Mara hesitated. From a 4th partner. One who never appears in print. Someone who was erased. She looked down, gripping her folder like a life raft. "My grandfather." Calder didn't move. The room behind him felt suddenly too small, too warm. The hatch's cold breath lingered in his memory. Outside, the trees hissed. Far on the ridge, a stray thunder roll crawled through the cloud cover. Echo's nose lifted. Alert again. Calder's voice dropped. "You need to leave." Mara's brows knit. "I don't understand. You shouldn't be here. Someone else is watching this ridge." He glanced beyond her into the tree line. "Someone who arrived before you," Mara paled. "I didn't see you wouldn't," Calder said. "But he's seen you." Something crunched in the woods, subtle, distant, but there. Echo's growl turned low-directional. Calder shut the door halfway. "Take your car. Head straight down the road. Don't stop." Mara shook her head. "If someone's out there, I'm not leaving you alone. I want you gone," he said. "I'm not asking." She held his stare. Something in her expression shifted determination, tempered by fear. "I know you're hiding something," she said. "Maybe something dangerous. But whatever was buried here, my family deserves to know why." Echo barked sharply, one short, urgent burst. Calder's muscles locked. "Go," he snapped. "Now." Mara's eyes flickered between him and Echo. She looked like she wanted to protest, argue, demand, answers anything but retreat. But she stepped back. "I'm coming back, Mr. Rourke," she whispered. "Not until I tell you it's safe." A beat, a breath. Then she turned and strode into the rain down the steps toward her car. Echo watched her go tail stiff. Calder closed the door, locked it, turned, and froze. The photograph on the table, the one he'd retrieved from the chamber, was no longer lying flat. It leaned upright, propped at a precise angle. Echo had been beside him the whole time. The wind hadn't touched it. Calder stepped forward slowly. Someone had moved it. Recently, his pulse spiked. His breath shortened in that too familiar way, the way it did when an unseen threat pressed too close. "Echo," he whispered. The dog stood beside him, posture rigid, gaze fixed on the photograph. Calder picked it up. The three men in front of the cabin stared back Rowan Rourke, Harlan Keene, Brant Leland. He turned the frame over. A single line was scratched, faint, almost invisible, into the wood. 4 into 3 never fits. A tremor rippled through Calder's chest. Someone had touched the frame after he'd brought it inside. Someone had been in the cabin, and they'd left a message. Echo whined once low, tense, afraid on Calder's behalf. Calder exhaled shakily. "We're past luck now, boy. We need answers." He grabbed the lantern again, the journal, the blueprint, the plaque. He shoved them into a bag with shaking hands. "I'm not waiting for nightfall," he said. "We're going back down." Echo moved instantly to his side. As Calder opened the door, the rain had softened, but the forest felt colder, dimmer, as if the ridge itself was holding its breath. But the truth was there in the chamber, the documents, the marks on the frame. Answers lived underground, and someone else wanted them first. "Come on," Calder said. "Stay close." Echo pressed forward, ears pinned, scanning every shadow. Together they walked back toward the pit. The hatch waited in silence. The tarp over the hatch shivered in the thin wind as Calder and Echo stepped into the clearing again. The rain had slackened to a steady mist beating on the metal and darkening the churned earth. The pit looked deeper now, like the mountain had exhaled, and sunk half an inch further into itself. Echo went straight to the edge nose, low tail level. He scanned the tree line first, then the hatch. No growl this time, just a slow, uneasy whine. "Yeah," Calder said. "Somebody's been closer than they should." He swept the area out of habit. No fresh footprints in the mud other than his own and Mara's theirs already softened by rain. Whoever had handled the photograph hadn't left an easy trail. Either they were careful or they'd been here before the storm in drier days. He didn't like either option. Calder peeled back the tarp, lifted the hatch, and let the cold air flow out again. It hit his face with the same still stale touch, no draft, no hint of fresh intrusion. Underground and inside told different stories. Above ground, someone had moved freely. Below, the chamber felt trapped in time. Echo hesitated at the top of the stairs, then sat watching Calder's descent with hawk intensity. "I won't be long," Calder said. "If anything moves up there, you shout." Echo gave a single quiet huff. Agreement. The chamber was unchanged, at least on the surface. Lantern light washed over shelves, crates, concrete. Dust motes drifted through the beam like slow ash. Calder set the bag on the desk and laid out the contents blueprint journal brass plaque. He unrolled the blueprint carefully. The paper crackled stiff with age. A precise hand had drawn the plan of the chamber, complete with measurements, notes, revisions. It wasn't just a shelter, it was a vault. In one corner, a neat block of text read, "Joint Holding Facility, Phase 3. Rourke divided by Keene, divided by Leland." He traced the walls with his fingertip. No hidden rooms marked. No secret compartments. But in the margin tucked where most would miss it, someone had written a series of numbers and letters. 10 newtons, 4 watts, 5 UP 2 seconds, 8 E 5 UP 12 newtons, 1 E 5 UP. They meant nothing at first glance. But Calder's mind slipped automatically into the old patterns, coordinate grids, distances, elevation. "Not field coordinates," he murmured. "Room coordinates." He imagined the chamber as a box, each corner a reference point. 3 directions, north divided by south, east divided by west, up from the floor. 3 different measurements from 3 different starting edges. Triangulation. Rowan Rourke might not have been a soldier, but he had the same practical streak. Calder knew well from childhood stories. If he wanted to hide a thing, he'd do it in a way the land itself could remember. Calder straightened. "You hid something in here." He scanned the walls. At eye level, everything looked uniform, same rough finish, same hairline cracks. He knelt, then stood on the desk following measurements in his head. Count off 10 feet from the far wall, 4 feet from the side, 5 feet up. He tapped that spot with his knuckles. Concrete, solid. Move to the second set. Tap, concrete. Third set. Tap. The sound was wrong this time. Not hollow, but denser, as if 2 layers met. He pressed his ear against the wall. Faintly, he could hear his own pulse. The lantern hummed softly, but behind that, the absence. No give, no echo, just a sense that the wall was thicker than the others. He pulled back, jaw tightening. "You did bury something in the concrete." Echo barked above, muffled by the hatch. Calder called up, "Just walls, boy." Echo answered with a shorter, questioning bark that carried down like an accusation. "Are you sure?" Calder's gaze drifted to the brass plaque. HRR. The initials meant nothing to the blueprint. Not Rourke, not Keene, not Leland. "Fourth into three never fits," he muttered. The phrase on the photo frame had bitten at him since he'd read it. 3 names on a blueprint, 3 signatures on old deeds, 3 smiling faces in the photograph, but someone else had carved a message into the wood. Someone who'd been squeezed out of a partnership. Someone whose initials weren't on the plaque. He opened the journal again further in this time. Past inventory lists dates, simple accounts. The later entries grew shorter and tenser. Keene says the vault must remain sealed until we all agree. I don't trust his patience. Brandt thinks we're getting in too deep. He has no idea how deep we already are. The fourth deserves his share. We all know that. But Keene talks like we can divide something without him knowing. No names, no direct admissions. Whoever wrote this knew how to write around the truth. The last paragraph on the last page was different. Lines pressed deeply, ink darker. If this is found, it means time has done what we wouldn't exposed us. We divided 3 ways, what was shaped by 4 hands. There is no clean portion, no honest slice. The mountain remembers. The concrete remembers. And God remembers. Calder shut the journal. The walls seemed closer now. He'd once knelt in a different concrete room, his hands slick with blood, the thump of rotor blades pounding above like a second heartbeat. "Stay with me, Sawyer," he'd said, palms pressed to his friend's chest. "You're fine. I've got you." Sawyer had smiled a wild, unfocused thing. "You're terrible at lying, Cal. Shut up and breathe." He'd followed the steps exactly, pressure airway stabilize. The tourniquet was perfect. The bandaging clean, the medevac on its way. He'd done everything right. Sawyer had died anyway. Afterward, Calder learned the simple math of survival on paper time, of injury time, to treatment odds, percentages. But his mind never forgot the other numbers. Distance between them and the blast, the angle Sawyer had turned at the last second, the extra 5 seconds Calder had taken to check a different soldier's bandage before turning to his friend. 4 into 3 never fits. One of them hadn't come home. "Not the same," Calder whispered into the empty chamber. His voice sounded small. Different choices, different men. But the feeling was the same. Someone had been cut out. Someone had paid the cost. Echo barked again. This time the sound had a different edge, impatience. Calder grabbed the journal and blueprint, stowed them back in the bag, and climbed the stairs. When he emerged, Echo shoved his head against Calder's hip like he'd been gone hours, not minutes. "Yeah," Calder said, roughly, fingers sinking into thick fur. "I'm still here." He closed the hatch and covered it once more. The mist deepened, blurring the tree line. Somewhere below the ridge, a vehicle engine faintly droned. Not Mara's small sedan. A heavier growl, thicker tires. Calder turned toward the cabin. "Time to go," he said. Echo moved at his heel, body coiled. They reached the porch, just as the first glint of dark metal appeared between the trees. A black SUV wound its way up the muddy drive with the slow confidence of someone who knew they were expected, even if they weren't invited. Echo's growl turned low and steady. Inside, Calder murmured. They stepped into the cabin as the SUV stopped. Doors opened with soft, controlled clicks. No slam, no haste. These weren't people surprised or anxious. They were arriving on schedule. Calder set the bag under the table and dropped a folded blanket over the chair to hide the bulge. He took a breath that barely filled his chest. Echo stood squarely between the door, and the table lips peeled back just enough to show teeth. There was another knock, not like Mara's. Firmer. 3 raps evenly spaced. Calder opened the door halfway. A man in his early 50s stood on the porch, tall tan, dressed in a dark wool coat that didn't belong on mountain backroads. His hair was silver at the temples, combed perfectly. He wore no hat, despite the mist. His shoes were wrong for the mud, but they carried no splash. He'd walked carefully. His smile was practiced. Professional. "Mr. Rourke," he said smoothly. "We've been hoping to meet you." 2 men stood behind him on the gravel, thicker around the shoulders, hands tucked casually in jacket pockets, eyes scanning the trees instead of the cabin. Their posture screamed private security. Calder let the silence hang. Echo's growl filled it. "And you are?" Calder asked. "Marshal Keene?" The man extended a hand he had to know wouldn't be taken. "My family's name might be on some of your older land records. I'm sure the courthouse is still cluttered with those old documents." Calder didn't move. "Records I own now." "Of course." Marshall let the hand fall without offense. "Absolutely. Which is why I wanted to speak with you in person, neighbor to neighbor." Echo barked once, sharp, explosive. The men on the gravel tensed reflexively. Marshall's smile thinned. "Impressive animal." "Stay," Calder said quietly. Echo's growl cut off mid-rumble, but his body stayed taut. "What do you want?" Calder asked. Marshall's gaze flicked over Calder's shoulder, taking in the cabin interior at a glance. Wood stove table, old radio, nothing else inviting. I represent certain historical interests on this ridge, Marshall said. My grandfather and yours did business together. There were investments, shared undertakings. Over time, things were divided, reassigned. But a few assets, physical ones, were never properly accounted for. I believe one of them may be on your land. Then, you believe wrong, Calder said. Marshall chuckled lightly. I admire the instinct to protect what's yours. I truly do. But some things don't belong to any one of us, Mr. Rourke. They belong to the agreements made before we were born. He tilted his head, studying Calder, as if cataloging reactions. I have copies of those agreements, Marshall continued. They're quite clear. They mention a storage facility, sealed and concealed under joint control. They also mention that if one party or his heir refuses to honor the terms, the others are empowered to act. Empowered to steal, Calder asked. Empowered to reclaim. Marshall's eyes cooled. You've uncovered something. You might not know what it is yet, but I assure you it was never intended to be your burden. He took half a step closer. I'm here to offer a simple solution. Let my team take a look around. We'll make an inventory of anything that seems historically relevant. In return, we'll compensate you more than fairly for the disturbance. And if I say no, Marshall's smile didn't change, but something hard slid into his gaze. Then I'm afraid we'd have to involve the courts. And in my experience, prolonged legal disputes can be exhausting for someone who only came here for peace. Echo snarled softly, taking a step forward, hackles fully up now. Marshall's eyes flicked to the dog. Call him off, Mr. Rourke. I'm trying to be respectful. He is being respectful, Calder said. He hasn't bitten anyone yet. One of the men behind Marshall shifted his weight. The other's jaw tightened. Marshall sighed as if the whole situation bored him. Stubbornness doesn't impress me. It just wastes time. I'll give you a few days to think. In the meantime, he slipped a card from his pocket and set it carefully on the porch railing. If you find anything unusual, anything that doesn't feel like it belongs to you, call me. We'll handle it, discreetly. Calder glanced at the card but didn't touch it. Marshall stepped back. We'll talk again soon. He turned, walked back to the SUV without looking over his shoulder, and climbed in. The two men followed. The vehicle reversed slowly, then rolled back down the hill, taillights glowing faintly red in the mist. Echo stayed rigid until the sound of the engine faded. Then he let out a breathy, uncertain whine. Yeah, Calder said softly. He's not going away. He shut the door and locked it. The cabin felt smaller again. The bag under the table weighed more than it should. Echo circled once, then lay down, this time with his body angled toward both the door and the table, as if he'd appointed himself guardian of both thresholds. Calder sank into a chair. The journal's words, the blueprint's coordinates, the scratched message on the frame, they all braided together with Marshall Keene's smooth threat. He picked up the business card at last. The Keene family crest was embossed in silver at the top. Beneath the name and number in fine print was a line that made Calder's stomach knot: asset recovery and legacy management. Legacy, Calder repeated under his breath. Echo's ears flicked. If they get their hands on what's down there, Calder said, no one else ever sees it. The kettle on the stove whistled softly. He ignored it. His mind was already moving, mapping the chamber, the coordinates, the wall that sounded wrong. He needed help to decode the rest. He needed someone who understood how families disappeared from the record without ever leaving town. He needed Mara. Calder stood, reached for his keys, then hesitated. There was almost no reception in the cabin. He'd have to drive halfway to the highway to get a clear call through. Marshall's SUV had gone that way. He looked at Echo. We're not waiting for him to make the next move. Echo stood before he finished the sentence. Let's go find the historian with too much courage, Calder said. They stepped out into the thin rain. The mountains smelled of wet leaves and distant coal dust. Behind them, under a tarp, the hatch waited. Ahead of them, somewhere in town, someone else held pieces of the same puzzle and a grandfather's missing name. The ridge would not keep its secrets much longer. The drive down the mountain road was slow and slick. Mud fanned beneath the truck tires and mist curled over the hood in thin, ghost-like veils. Echo sat upright in the passenger seat, gaze, tracking the passing trees like they held answers. Calder gripped the wheel harder than necessary, the business card in his jacket pocket burning like a match head. Marshall Keene hadn't sounded like a man bluffing. He sounded like a man who already believed he owned whatever lay beneath this ridge. And that meant Calder needed information fast. They reached the halfway point where cell reception flickered into a single bar. Calder braked on the shoulder engine, idling low. The pine canopy above dripped cold water onto the windshield. He pulled up Mara's number from the letter she'd sent weeks ago and hit call. It rang twice. Dr. Leland. It's Calder Rourke. A pause. Not hostile, not surprised, something in between. You told me to leave. You listened. I thought you'd wait a week before contacting me. We don't have a week. Another pause. More breath than silence. Where are you, Northridge Road? I can meet you in town. 15 minutes. No, Mara said quickly. Come to the library instead. Less traffic, less attention. She didn't have to explain. Calder appreciated that. I'm on my way. He ended the call. Echo whined once softly as if asking, Are you sure about this one? No, Calder answered. But she's not the threat. Echo settled with a faint grunt. But his eyes stayed watchful. The county library sat like a forgotten brick holdout from the 1,952nd squat rectangular, flanked by a half-collapsed community garden and one flickering lamppost. Mara stood under the awning hood up, scanning the parking lot with academic suspicion. When she saw Calder, she motioned him inside quickly. I didn't want your friend seeing me, she murmured. Friend, Calder repeated, half-scoffing. Is that what Keene calls himself now? Mara stiffened. Keene, as in Harlan Keene, his grandson, Calder said. Marshall. Her expression shifted, scholarship crashing headlong into dread. He came to your house with muscle. Mara closed her eyes briefly. Then, it's worse than I thought. They moved into a back reading room surrounded by shelves of genealogy books and dusty binders. Echo lay by the door body, angled outward, guarding the hallway with military vigilance. Calder dropped the bag onto a wooden table. Mara approached with careful reverence. You brought them. Didn't have a choice, he said. Somebody else handled the photograph in my cabin. Started leaving messages. Mara froze. Inside your home, yeah. What message? Calder hesitated. But withholding wasn't an option anymore, he told her. Her hand went to her mouth. 4 into 3 never fits. My grandfather used to say something similar. 3 stories fold easy. The 4th never does. I thought it was just one of his old academic metaphors. Maybe it was something else. Calder laid out the blueprint. These are coordinates. Mara leaned close breath, fogging slightly in the cold library air. North, south, east, west, and elevation. It's a triangulation. That's what I thought. She pulled a small tape measure from her bag. Show me the chamber dimensions. Calder walked her through them. 15 by 10 by 7 feet tall walls, uniform except for the west side, which felt different. She sketched quickly. Mara connected the coordinate lines on her pad. 3 points, all intersecting a single small region on the west wall, roughly the size of a shoebox raised about 5 feet above the floor. Something's hidden there, she whispered. I checked, Calder said. Concrete was solid. Not if it's double-layered, she murmured. Vault builders sometimes hide compartments inside poured walls. You'd never know unless you had the blueprint, or the coordinates. Exactly, Echo growled suddenly. Both of them turned. No one was in the hall. No shadow, no footstep. But Echo was locked on something deeper, something he sensed but couldn't see. He hasn't been wrong yet, Calder said. We should keep moving. Mara nodded and gathered her papers. We need to go back before Keene does. Calder's jaw set. He said he'd give me a few days. What does that mean to someone like him? Mara asked. He's already searching in the dark. Once he figures out what's buried, he'll come take it, Calder finished. Mara's face softened. You didn't ask for any of this. Neither did you. They exchanged a look, one of reluctant partnership, forged under pressure neither of them had chosen. They drove back with no headlights until they reached the turn for Calder's property. Echo stayed seated but alert, tracking every passing shadow like a sentry. When they parked near the pit, Calder scanned the tree line. No SUV. No broken branches. No cigarette butts or prints. Nothing visible, but visibility meant little. The ridge was quiet, in a way that wasn't natural, not after days of rain, not with owls nesting nearby. It's holding its breath, Mara whispered. Yeah, Calder said. That's how it gets before a storm that isn't weather. Echo whined once. They descended together. The hatch groaned open again. Cold air rose, ancient, undisturbed. The mountain exhaled secrets. Calder took the lantern and entered first. Mara followed, notebook in hand. Echo waited at the top, ears rotating constantly, nose working the shifting air. The chamber swallowed sound. Calder could hear his own heartbeat. He went straight to the west wall, lantern raised. Mara approached it with a scholar's reverence. 5 feet up, she said. Start there. Calder pressed the wall. Solid. He knocked. A dull thud. He moved left 12 inches and tried again. This time it sounded different, denser, heavier. Mara's eyes widened. Right there. That's the cavity. Calder swallowed. What's in it? Only one way to know. He wedged the crowbar into a hairline crack near the seam. It wasn't obvious, only visible where water had trickled during construction decades ago. The metal bit. He leaned his weight. The wall resisted. Echo barked above, sharp, urgent. Mara tensed. What was that? Warning, Calder said. Someone's close. He pried harder. The concrete groaned. A thin fracture spread outward like a spider web across the plastered surface. Dust fell, clogging the air. Mara covered her mouth as Calder struck the wall again, once, twice, 3 times. The third blow punched through. A hole opened into darkness. Flashlight, he muttered. Mara handed hers over. Calder reached into the cavity, fingers brushing something smooth. Cold. Hard. He pulled it free. A box. Metal. Seamless. Heavy as stone. No latch. No inscriptions. Mara swallowed. What is it, Calder? Turned it over slowly. Echo barked again, this time frantic. Mara, Calder said, voice dropping. We need to go. He grabbed the box, shoved the blueprint and journal into his bag, and moved toward the stairs. Mara followed, breath ragged. Echo was pacing at the top, ears, pinned tail, stiff teeth bare. The dog wasn't reacting to predators or wildlife. He was reacting to people. Calder extinguished the lantern and shut the hatch. They crouched together behind a fallen log 10 yards from the clearing. Rain pattered softly on leaves. A vehicle engine murmured up the road. Not one engine. 2. Headlights swept through the trees, searching, deliberate. Mara's voice barely rose above breath. That's them. Calder's pulse hammered. He moved faster than expected. Marshal Keene stepped out of the first SUV, umbrella in hand, followed by 2 men. Another pair emerged from the second vehicle, spreading out with practiced ease. Flashlights ignited white beams across the clearing. Mara trembled. We shouldn't be here, no, Calder said. We need to see what he does. Keene walked straight toward the pit as if he'd been here before. He hadn't wasted his time. He hadn't believed Calder. Or worse, someone had told him exactly where to look. One of the men pulled the tarp back. Keene leaned over the hatch wheel, smiling faintly. Found you. Mara's breath hitched. Calder clenched his jaw. Echo, he whispered. Not a sound. The dog froze, muscles coiled, listening with every nerve. Keene turned to his men. Open it. We should wait for tools, one of them said. Keene's smile sharpened. We don't have time. He kneeled and grasped the wheel. Calder held his breath. For a terrifying second, Calder imagined the hatch turning. Echo's entire body trembled, ready to leap. But the hatch didn't move. Keene swore under his breath and straightened. It stuck. They must have sealed it. One of his men tried. No movement. Keene exhaled sharply. Fine. We do it my way. Bring the rig tomorrow. At dawn. We cut it open. He turned away, walking toward the vehicle's umbrella, angled against the thin rain. Whatever they hid down there, he said to his men, I will have it. The SUVs pulled out one after the other, tires crunching wet gravel, until the sound faded. Mara sagged forward, trembling. He knows. He knows everything. Calder didn't answer. His mind was moving, scanning options, counting hours. He had a window. Not a large one, but a window. We're out of time, he said quietly. We need to get the contents of that wall safe before dawn. And then we figure out what we're holding. Mara looked at the metal box. It's cold, even through the wrapping. Echo sniffed the box once and backed away, ears, tilted back, uncertainty, not fear. What's inside? She whispered. Calder stared at it. Whatever it was, 4 men once built a vault to protect it, and then 3 of them erased the 4th. Something worth killing for, he said. And something worth burying, Mara said softly. And now Calder added something we can't let Keene touch. He turned toward the cabin, the box heavy in his grip, Echo pressed to his side. The ridge felt alive now, watching, waiting. The storm outside had passed. But the other storm, the human one, was just beginning. They didn't speak until the truck door shut behind them. Rain whispered on the roof. The ridge outside was a shadow of black pines and wet stone. Echo sat in the back seat, head between them, as if to keep them both from drifting apart. Calder set the metal box on his lap. It felt colder now, as though the air around it had dropped a few degrees. Mara stared at it. We should wait until we're inside. We don't have time, Calder said. He's coming at dawn, she whispered. Calder checked his watch. 6 hours. Less if he decides to skip sleep. Echo whined softly, nose pressed to the box, then recoiled with a quiet huff, as if the metal itself carried a scent of wrongness. Whatever's in there, Mara said. My grandfather bled for it. Maybe literally. I'm not walking away again. Calder looked at her. Her face was pale, but her jaw was set. She reminded him suddenly of the medics he'd known who kept moving long after their hands shook. He nodded once. We open it. Then we decide. The cabin felt smaller than ever when they stepped inside. The wood stove was cold. He hadn't bothered to light it before they left. Now the air felt like concrete, hard, unmoving. Calder set the box on the table. Mara hovered opposite. Echo lay down at the corner body, angled toward the door, but his gaze locked on them. There's no visible seam, Calder said. No latch. Maybe it's pressure sealed, Mara said. Or she hesitated. Or maybe whoever hid it didn't want it opened at all. Calder flexed his fingers, then wrapped both hands around the box. Too late for that. He checked each edge, feeling for give. Nothing. He tried twisting the top, then the sides. There was no shift, no hint of mechanical play. Let me, Mara said. He stepped back. She ran her fingertips over the surface, eyes narrowing. This isn't just generic iron. Feel that. It's heavier, Calder said. Too heavy for its size. Lead-lined, maybe. For preservation. She frowned. Or protection. What were they protecting, he asked. Mara looked up at him. You already know the answer. The words hit harder than the question. Calder did know. Whatever lay inside, 4 men had once decided it was worth cementing into a wall, then hiding the directions among coded notes. 3 of those men had survived long enough to erase the 4th. He thought of Marshal Keene's practiced smile. Stand back, he said. He grabbed a flathead screwdriver and a small hammer from the counter and wedged the tip against one corner. The first tap bounced uselessly. The second bit, the third drove it deeper with a dull metallic crack. Mara flinched. Easy, she breathed. That might be the last intact thing my grandfather left. Calder slowed, working methodically, rotating the box and attacking each corner. Metal protested, groaned, resisted. Then the lid jerked half an inch. A faint hiss escaped, like old air sighing out. Calder pried his fingers under the edge and lifted. The smell was immediate and unmistakable: old paper, old ink, and the faint chemical tang of magnetic tape. Inside, wrapped in waxed cloth, lay a stack of documents bound with twine, a narrow leather wallet cracked at the fold, a cassette tape in a clear plastic case labeled in neat handwriting statement, H. Keene divided by B. Leland divided by R. Rourke, 1962. Mara's hand flew to her mouth. They recorded something. Calder picked up the tape. His thumb brushed the inked name R. Rourke. His chest tightened. Your grandfather, Mara whispered. And yours, he said. And Keene's. Echo gave a low, uneasy growl. Not at the box this time, at the tape. You have anything that can play it, Mara asked, voice thin. Calder tapped the old cassette deck on the shelf near the radio. Came with the place. I've never used it. Please tell me it works, she murmured. He slid the tape in, pressed it down, and hit play. For a moment there was only static, a long, grainy hiss that sounded like rain on tin. Then a voice cut through, clearer than it had any right to be after 6 decades. This is Rowan Rourke, the voice said. Calder's spine stiffened. Date October 18th, 1962. Present are Harlan Keene and Brant Leland. This is our record. God help us. The sound of a chair creaking. A sigh. Mara's fingers dug into the edge of the table. I don't see the point of this, another voice, sharper, impatient, said. You're wasting tape, Rowan. That's Keene, Mara whispered. I've heard recordings of him in university archives. Rowan's voice came again, quieter but steady. We agreed. If we're going to bury everything else, we leave one truth behind. Locked away, at least. Keene, if you don't want this, a third voice, softer, cut in. Let the man speak. If you're so sure no one will ever hear this, what are you afraid of? Brant Mara breathed. My grandfather. Calder's chest felt too small. Rowan exhaled. 4 of us built that fortune. 4 of us invested. 4 of us took the risk. Harlan, you decided 3 would walk away with it. He signed his share over. Keene snapped. We all saw the papers. He knew exactly what he was doing. He signed under duress, Brant said. You held the mortgage on his house. You threatened to foreclose if he didn't consolidate assets with us. A long silence. Tape hiss. Rowan again, voice frayed. We took the deeds, the accounts. We funneled them into the joint vault. We told ourselves we'd make sure he was provided for anyway. We did provide for him, Keene said coldly. Right up until he disappeared. Because you drove him to it, Brant shot back. You salivated over his numbers for years. We both saw it. Calder's grip on the table tightened until his knuckles whitened. "This is pointless," Keen said. "We sealed the vault. We agreed the assets would stay untouched until we three or our heirs needed them." Reyes made his choice when he walked away. Mara's head jerked up. "Reyes," she whispered. He said Reyes. Calder's heart lurched. The missing fourth partner had a name. "And if someone finds this?" Brant asked on the tape. "What then? Then they'll know he trusted us and we failed him," Rowan said. "And maybe whoever hears it will do what we wouldn't." The tape crackled, then almost too soft to catch. "This ridge is built over a grave," Rowan whispered. "Not in the earth. In our houses, in our families. We cut a man out of his own life's work. We turned 4 into 3. That's a kind of killing." Silence. Keen's voice brisk. "Enough." A click. The tape whirred to an end. Calder hit stop. The cabin hummed with quiet. The only sound was Echo's breathing and the faint patter of rain. Mara's cheeks were wet. She hadn't noticed the tears until one dropped onto the table. "He said his name," she whispered. "Reyes. Mateo Reyes. That's my grandfather. He died a clerk in a factory. Everyone said he'd wasted his mind. He kept telling family there'd been a mistake, an injustice. No one believed him." "Not really." Calder's throat was dry. "Rowan believed him," he managed. "He believed him, and still kept the vault," she said. Her voice shook. "He kept the money. He built a life on it. A house. Land. This ridge." Calder couldn't argue. He could almost see Rowan as a young man standing with the others in that faded photograph full of ambition. Somewhere between the smiling faces and the sealed vault, they'd crossed a line. "Your grandfather left this record anyway," he said. "Maybe this was his last try at doing something right." "He locked the truth in concrete, Calder," she said, eyes burning. "What good is a confession no one hears?" He didn't answer. The guilt tightening in his chest wasn't entirely his, but it sat there all the same. Echo came closer, pressing his head under Calder's hand with a soft insistence. The touch broke through the ice in his chest. "You're thinking you're just like him," Mara said quietly. "A man who sees wrong and freezes." Calder looked up sharply. "I've read your file," she said, unashamed. "You're not invisible, Calder. You were a medic who lost men. Everyone back home turned that into a legend. He saved as many as he lost. Do you know how most medics end up?" He didn't want to hear it. "They fold," she answered anyway. "They blame themselves for math that never worked. 4 into 3 never fits." She reached across the table, fingers hovering over the tape case. "You're not responsible for what he did," she said. "But you're standing where he stood. You either repeat the pattern or you break it." Calder stared at the box, the documents, the tape, the house he'd been trying to make into a refuge. Breaking it meant more than just handing evidence over. It meant dismantling the only inheritance his family had left. "You think I can just walk away from this land?" he asked. "Can you live on it?" she said softly, knowing whose bones are under the foundation. Echo whined, low empathic, as if he felt the question vibrate through Calder's bones. Calder thought of Sawyer on the concrete blood slipping through his fingers. How helpless he'd felt. How useless his training seemed in the face of a timing difference measured in seconds. He hadn't had a choice then. He had one now. He stood abruptly, chair scraping back. "I need to make a call." "Keen's probably listening," Mara warned. "Then I'll let him hear what I want him to hear." There was only one pocket of reception above the ridge, the same overlook where he'd taken the first call from Mara. Calder drove there with Echo in the passenger seat and the tape player on his lap. Mara stayed behind in the cabin, tasked with photographing every page of the documents and backing them up on her cloud account whenever a flicker of signal passed through. Calder dialed a number from a part of his memory he'd tried to keep closed. "Sheriff's office, this is Lane." Eli, Calder said. "It's Cal. A beat. Haven't heard that voice in a while. I wouldn't call if it wasn't serious. Talk." Calder didn't waste words. He sketched the essentials: hidden chamber, old vault joint holdings, pressure from Marshall Keene, asset recovery threats. He described the tape without yet sending it. "You're sure it's real?" Lane asked. "You tell me," Calder said. He held his phone to the speaker and played the most damning segment, the names, the admission, the line about cutting 4 into 3. When it ended, the silence on the line was long. Then Lane exhaled. "That's enough to justify a warrant, assuming we can prove authenticity." "And you say Keen's coming up in the morning with men and equipment," Don Calder said. "To cut into my land. You armed shotgun. Non-lethal rounds. I'm not looking to start a war. I'm not letting one happen on my watch," Lane said. The soldier's edge in his voice hadn't dulled with age. "Here's what we'll do. I'll get a judge out of bed for an emergency order. Probable cause is strong enough. We'll be at the bottom of your road before sunrise lights off. If Keene sets foot on that property with intent to seize or destroy evidence, we catch him in the act, Good Calder said. Cal, yeah, don't try to handle this alone. Calder glanced at Echo. I'm not alone, Lane huffed. I mean without me. We'll be ready, Calder said. He hung up. Echo nudged his shoulder as if to say, You finally called for backup. Yeah, Calder murmured. Took me long enough. They didn't sleep. Mara had stacked printed photographs of the documents in one neat pile on the table. The originals went back into the metal box, sealed as best they could. Calder tucked that box under the old pantry floorboards beneath canned beans and flour sacks, mundane guardians for incendiary truth. What if they tear the house apart, Mara asked. Then they don't find it, he said. And if they do, then Lane arrests them for tampering with evidence before they get far. He moved through the cabin in careful circuits, checking windows, door frames, the 12-gauge he'd loaded with rubber pellets. Enough to drop a man, not enough to kill. I don't want blood on this floor, he said. Not mine, not theirs. Do you think that's up to you? She asked. Echo paced with them, hitting every point in the loop like he understood the perimeter. Calder copied Lane's number to a sticky note on the wall near the door. Then he scribbled one more line beneath it. 4 into 3, never fits. He didn't want to forget why he was doing this when things got loud. Mara watched him. You're different from him, she said. Rowan, yes. He buried the truth. You're dragging it into daylight. He met her gaze. Don't put me on a pedestal yet. Echo stopped moving and sat by the door. The sky outside the windows had shifted from black to navy, the hour before dawn. A faint glowing line gathered behind the eastern ridge. They're coming, Calder said. Echo growled low and sure. The SUVs arrived exactly when Keene had promised, just as the world turned from night to ash-gray morning. This time, they didn't keep engines quiet. They came like a declaration grinding up the road with all the subtlety of a convoy. Calder stood on the porch, shotgun lowered but visible. Mara waited just inside the door camera-ready phone recording. Echo sat at Calder's side, a statue of muscle and focus. Keene stepped out, flanked by 4 men in heavier gear than the day before. Gloves. Tool cases. One carried a compact hydraulic cutter. No more neighborly visits, Calder called. Keene's smile was thin. I gave you a chance to cooperate. You chose otherwise. I chose the law, Calder said. Did you? Keene's gaze flicked to the ridge. Then I'm sure they'll be very interested in why your land holds a vault with my family's investment in it. Echo's growl deepened, vibrating through Calder's boot soles. Last chance, Mr. Rourke, Keene said. Step aside and this stays between us. Dig in and you'll lose more than a patch of dirt. Calder thought of the ridge, the chamber, the tape, the name Reyes, the weight of his grandfather's voice saying, we cut a man out of his own life's work. He lifted the shotgun not to aim at a person but toward the air. You're not taking another inch, he said. Not from me. Not from them. Keene's smile vanished. Guys, 2 men moved forward, Echo Calder whispered. Stay. Watch Mara. He stepped backward onto the porch, drawing the men's focus. They advanced hands-out postures, half calming, half predatory. We don't want trouble, sir, one said. Then turn around, Calder replied. The first man reached for the shotgun barrel. Calder fired not at the man but at the old steel bell hanging from the corner beam, a relic from when the cabin was a hunting camp. The blast of rubber shot hit the bell dead center. The bell exploded with sound, an iron scream that tore across the ridge, echoing down the hollow, amplified by the woods into something wild and impossible to ignore. The men flinched, hands flying to their ears. One dropped to a knee, disoriented. Keene swore shouting orders no one could hear over the ringing. That was the plan's first beat noise. Obvious, undeniable, and carrying straight down to the road where Lane waited. The second beat came from Echo. One of the men staggered toward the door, recovering faster than the others. He spotted Mara behind the glass and lunged for the handle, intending to pull her out as leverage. Echo moved. He launched from the side like a fired round, hitting the man square in the hip. Teeth clamped on the forearm, reaching for the knob. The man screamed high and panicked, all controlled menace gone, and went down hard on the porch boards. Echo off, Calder barked. The dog released instantly but stayed braced over the fallen man, teeth bared a breath from flesh. A living warning. The third beat arrived on strobing wheels. Red and blue lights flashed through the trees as 2 sheriff's trucks roared up the drive sirens, screaming over the last trembling notes of the bell. Lane stepped out before the engine's cut hand already on his holster. Everybody freeze, he shouted. His voice cracked through the chaos like a command on a deployment. Drop the tools, hands where I can see them. Keene spun shock and fury warring on his features. This is private property, he snapped. Exactly, Lane said. and you're trespassing with intent to tamper with a crime scene. This is a civil matter, not when it involves concealed assets linked to a recorded confession, Lane said coldly. He nodded at Calder. You bring it. Calder held up the tape player. You'll want to hear the part where he names names. Mara stepped out behind Calder, her phone still recording tears on her face and steel in her spine. This ridge was never yours, she said to Keene. You built your empire on a stolen foundation. Keene stared at her as if seeing her for the first time. Leland, he whispered. You're the girl. Granddaughter, she corrected. Echo's growl rose again as one of Keene's men twitched toward his pocket. Don't even think about it, Lane said, weapon leveled. On the ground. Now, one by one the men complied, dropping to their knees in the mud, hands interlaced behind their heads. Keene stood stubbornly chest-heaving. You don't know what you're playing with, he hissed. That vault holds more than you can imagine. Then the court will enjoy cataloging it, Lane said. Keene's gaze swung back to Calder. You could have had anything you wanted. A cut, a quiet buyout. Instead, you call in the law and the leeches. He spat toward the dirt. You're as short-sighted as your grandfather. Calder didn't step closer. He didn't raise his voice. He just said, My grandfather hid the truth. I'm not him. Echo moved to his side, pressing against his leg a solid, warm weight. Lane nodded, once approving. Marshal Keene, you and your men are under arrest for trespass, attempted evidence, destruction, and conspiracy to conceal proceeds of a historic fraud. You have the right to remain silent. As Lane spoke, the familiar words the ridge seemed to exhale. The tightness in the air thinned. Birds that had been silent since dawn began to stir in the trees. Calder looked at Echo. The dog's posture eased at last. His eyes still alert, softened as he leaned his head briefly against Calder's hip. You did it, Mara, whispered to both of them. You broke it. Not yet, Calder said quietly. We still have to give it back. Give what back? Everything, he said. He watched as Keene was led to the cruiser, hands cuffed. The man's polished shoes were stained with mountain mud. For the first time since Calder had arrived on this ridge, the land didn't feel like it belonged to him at all. And somehow that felt right. The ridge was quiet for a long time after the last patrol truck rolled away. The mud on the path was torn with tire tracks, but the forest had already begun stitching itself back together, pine needles drifting down rain, easing into a patient mist. Calder didn't move until Echo nudged his hand. The dog's touch pulled him back into his own skin. His shoulders lowered, his breath eased. For the first time in years, the tight place behind his ribs, where guilt and memory tangled like barbed wire, felt less like a wound and more like space. Mara stood beside him, rain glistening in her hair. She watched the empty road, then turned to him. Are you all right, she asked. Calder considered lying. Echo pressed his head against Calder's knee again, gentle grounding. No, Calder said quietly, but I think I will be. Mara nodded, a soft understanding in her eyes. The tape? The vault? Everything your grandfather hid, it's going to change a lot once it's in the public record. It should, Calder said, but none of it belongs to me. You're returning it. It was stolen before I ever touched it. He looked toward the slope where the chamber lay hidden beneath earth and roots. This land, the accounts, the assets, they weren't built by Rourke hands. They were built by Reyes. Mara's throat tightened. I don't think Sophia ever imagined justice would come this way. Calder gave a faint smile. Sometimes justice isn't lightning. Sometimes it's just telling the truth out loud. Echo huffed as though agreeing. A breeze passed over the ridge, lifting the rain-scented air. The storm had finally broken. The clouds were pulling apart in thin gray ribbons, letting the first weak light spill across the treetops. Mara wiped her eyes. What will you do now? Calder looked at the cabin behind him, weathered boards, a roof patched a dozen times, windows he had hand-fitted with glass that now reflected a man he barely recognized. A refuge once. A reckoning now. I'll sign the property over, he said. Let the Conservancy manage the ridge. Keep it wild. So you're leaving. He nodded. I came here to escape ghosts. But they weren't the ones I thought. Myra swallowed. I hope you find a place that doesn't hold so much weight. I will, he said. Not sure where yet, but somewhere that doesn't belong to someone else's story. Echo barked once, a small, resolute sound. Calder glanced down. Anywhere except near water, he teased softly. Remember that time in the creek? Echo tilted his head as if offended. Mara laughed, the first unforced laugh since they'd opened the vault. It loosened something in the air, made the ridge feel less like a crime scene, and more like a place capable of forgiveness. You won't go alone, she said. Calder ruffled Echo's ears. No, he murmured. Never again. They walked back toward the cabin. Mara helped gather the last of the copied documents, the taped confession and her notes. These would go to Lane now, then to the state attorney, then to the courts, then to history. A different kind of burial. One in plain sight. By noon, Mara's car was packed. She stood by her door with her hands tucked into her jacket sleeves. "You'll call when you're settled, if I have service," he said. She smiled. "That's not a no." They clasped hands, steady, grateful, changed. Then she climbed in and drove away down the narrow road until the trees swallowed her taillights. The ridge grew quiet again. Calder walked through the cabin one last time. Echo followed, sniffing each room as if performing a final inspection. The floors creaked under their steps, the sound familiar and gentle. He paused at the door, taking a final look. Then he exhaled, turned off the lights, and locked it behind him. They reached the truck. Echo leapt into the passenger seat with practiced ease, circling once before settling in. Calder ran a hand along the dog's back. "Ready?" he asked. Echo wagged his tail one solid thump against the seat. Calder slid into the driver's side. The engine turned over. He pulled onto the road. For a moment, just a moment, he saw Rowan Rourke in the rearview mirror, standing where the house met the trees. But when he blinked, it was only shadow and brush, and the fading outline of a place that no longer owned him. They crested the ridge. Morning sunlight broke through at last, soft and warm, painting the valley ahead in quiet gold. Roads wound west toward towns he'd never seen, and names he'd never heard. Echo rested his head on Calder's shoulder. Calder breathed in slow and steady, and for the first time in years, the silence around him felt like promise, not punishment. He shifted gears. They drove toward a new beginning. END.